Hey everyone, and welcome to this video where the topic of discussion today is going to be Intel's upcoming lineup of CPUs codenamed Alder Lake, which happen to be the 12th generation of their core lineup. This right here is a representational mock-up image, gives us some idea of what the silicon physical architecture of the chip is going to look like. We don't have actual images yet, it's not released. So this is kind of the best of what we have to go off at the moment. It gives us a lot to talk about. And the first thing I think we should start with is a bit of historical context because Alder Lake is not just any other CPU release. It's a big deal. Why is it a big deal? It's because it's coming in on the lineup of more than 10 years of Intel's core CPUs. And a lot has changed since the first core CPUs turned up on the market. So, firstly, when I say core CPUs, I mean the lineup of the Core i3s, the Core i5s, the Core i7s, and more recently the Core i9 CPUs. It's been 10 years since we've been getting down that product stack with generational improvements every couple of years or every year once in a while. And a lot has changed. When the core CPUs first turned up on the market, they pretty much dominated the CPU scene. They dominated the performance charts. They were the best CPUs you could buy, or at least some of the best CPUs you could buy. And since then, the tables are pretty much turned because the recent lineup, or at least the last few generations, most of the core CPUs have been completely outshadowed by their competition from AMD. Quite a bit has been written about this topic. It's been covered quite a lot. Everybody loves a good comeback story of the underdog, AMD being the underdog over here. And it's been covered in great detail. Here's one such article. There are quite a few written like this. And what this one says, Intel sat on its CPU monopoly and now the tide turns against them. Intel lost its drive to outperform. Intel's blueprint were more about AMD and their competitors than about their new CPUs. And so on and so forth. Basically referring to the fact that they felt AMD was just not going to be competitive against them. They really had no reason to kind of drive things along aggressively the way they had done in the past. And all that translated to stagnation. Now, when I say stagnation, what do I mean? Well, if you look over on Intel's Arc website, which is their database repository of their CPUs, and check out Intel core processors, you can go all the way back to the legacy series of core processors. And let's look around for the first one. This is a big page, so I'm just going to use page search to jump around. Look at the Core i7 975 processor. This was one of the top, I think the top, or the first lineup of Core i7 CPUs. I don't think there was an 8.5. No, so 975 it is. This is a 4-core CPU. So back then, quad cores pretty much cutting edge. 3.3 GHz base, 3.6 GHz boost clock release all the way back Q2 2009, long discontinued. What do I mean by stagnation? Let's see what Intel had to offer many years later. Going all the way to 7th generation of Intel's Core i7 CPUs, you see the highest end Core i7 7700K, Q1 2017, 8 years later, still 4 cores, still 8 threads. Definitely higher base and boost clocks, but complete stagnation on the core counts. And 2 cores, 4 cores, that's all they were offering. You can see the small product stack here as well. Intel really stagnated hard. They kind of felt they did not really need to drive this, they did not really need to push this. And well, the result of it was AMD coming out with their first generation of Ryzen CPUs with twice the core count at 8 cores at the same cost of the 7700K, while also somehow managing to be more power efficient than the 7700K. So imagine that, right? That's quite embarrassing for Intel, where the competitor comes up with a CPU with twice the cores and better power efficiency than your top end product, and it comes completely out of the blind side. You're not expecting it. And suffice to say, it's taken Intel some time to get back. They started upping core counts almost immediately. The 8700K, which is the top of the 8th generation of core CPUs, featured 8 cores. The 9th generation, featured 6 cores. The 9th generation pushed it up to 8 cores, and the 10th generation took it up to 10 cores. And then, funny enough, 11th generation brought it back down to 8 cores. And there are many reasons for that, but I'm not going to get into that too much because this video is not about 11th gen Rocket Lake CPUs. It's about the upcoming 12th gen Alder Lake CPUs and why they're a big deal. There are quite a few videos that have covered this stagnation in depth, and they're really good videos. Here's one such channel, Hardware Unboxed. Here's a recent video from them comparing 6 years of Intel stagnation at 14 nanometers. Now, I'm going to get to this, so don't pay a lot of attention to this point at the moment. What you need to see is 6 years of Intel CPUs, and the performance gains are often questionable. You don't this guy right here, right at the bottom of the chart, this is 6-year-old CPU versus the best of the best CPU from last year, and quite sometimes you're going to see that the performance uplifts are simply not there, even with the core counts and the clock speed advantages. Intel stagnated quite hard. At the same time, AMD really took off. This guy down here, the FX 8350 Black Edition, is AMD CPU from 2012, I think. So almost 10 years ago. You can see AMD almost tripling performance in that time. In fact, the Ryzen 7 1800X came out 2017. So just in a matter of 4 or 5 years, they're almost double performance. AMD has been really stepping up their game. Yeah, sure. Here they have a bunch of cores disabled, but it still gives you some kind of an idea of where they went. So wrong comparison there, but look at this: 4 cores of the 1800X versus 4 cores of the 5800X, which came out last year, and you can see a huge uplift just over there. So it's a pretty big deal, and AMD has been mounting the pressure non-stop. They've been executing and delivering, which is kind of caught Intel off guard. And Alder Lake coming out a month or so down the line now, maybe even at the end of October now, 2021, could be the start of Intel's return to form. So, what makes this such a big deal, and when is it coming out? So, number one, rumors say it's coming out pretty soon. Like I said, probably end of the month. Apparently, they're already for sale in China. Apparently, packaging has leaked. Whenever something leaks this much, you can pretty much be sure it's pretty close to release. Especially big company like Intel, they have a lot of channel partners making motherboards, making systems, system integrators, etc. A lot of people in the supply chain for a big company like Intel. So when something is imminent in the market, you're going to start seeing leaks like this. So we are not too far out. Definitely within the 2 months time frame, I would say. So what's in a name, right? So Intel's core architecture, the upcoming Alder Lake CPUs. Now they've been using this Lake brand name for quite some time, starting with Sky Lake, Whiskey Lake, Coffee Lake, Comet Lake. It's just the way they've been naming things, but there is a big difference here. You'll see that we don't see Alder Lake mentioned over here. Instead, you see a bunch of coves and a Grace Swan CPU. This highlights one of the biggest differences with Alder Lake, where Alder Lake is the first hybrid CPU architecture coming to desktop from Intel. Alder Lake is going to combine 2 different core architectures into one codenamed Alder Lake, and we're going to get into that pretty soon. So this right here is a presentation from Intel's recently concluded Architecture Day, 19 August 2021, introducing Alder Lake CPUs. Let's see what they have to say. They mention all client segments, 9 watts to 125 watts, all new core design with performance hybrid with Intel Thread Director, and a bunch of other stuff down here. A lot of new things here, a lot of very exciting things down here. Core of it being DDR5, but let's get to it one by one, right? So 9 watts to 125 watts. That means Alder Lake is going into everything from your ultra portable laptops and notebooks all the way up to your high-end desktop CPUs. It's going to span the entire product lineup. Of course, not mentioned on this slide is also the equivalent architecture going into the servers and the enterprise space. They call that Sapphire Rapids, I believe. It's further down this thing. I'll link this to in the video description. Those of you interested enough in this can go through this, and I'll also link the slides because they have the slides mentioned provided separately as well. So when you think of Alder Lake, there are 3 things you need to keep in mind which are key here. One is the process node. Alder Lake is going to be Intel's first 10 nanometer desktop CPUs, and we are going to get to that. The next thing is the hybrid architecture, which we just touched upon, but we'll detail further down. And lastly is the new DRAM generation, DDR5. These are 3 big changes, and they have the ability to allow Intel to take back the top spots on the CPU charts. In fact, jumping around a bit and talking about that, you look at the CPU hierarchy today. This is the latest ranking of CPUs available in the market. This is a gaming CPU benchmark. We see the top 5 CPUs. 4 of them are AMD. Let's go down and check out productivity benchmarks. Here you have single threaded performance, which highlights the performance of each individual core within a multi-core CPU. And again, you see AMD occupying a lot of the top spots here. Multi-core performance says the same story. AMD holds the first top 4 spots. So AMD pretty much has a solid lead in every significant category with Intel right now. Alder Lake might have the ability to turn that around with all these new features that we just touched upon. Let's dig into it into a bit of detail, starting with 10 nanometers. Right, those of you in the know a bit will know there's no other way to touch upon Alder Lake without first talking about the process node. So what's in a process node? What is the nanometer thing for those of you who are a little new to this? So when we talk about nanometers in the context of CPUs, we are referring to the fabrication process, which is the process node. Now, Wikipedia here, let's just focus on the first line, defines a process node saying semiconductor device fabrication is the process used to manufacture semiconductor devices, typically the metal oxide semiconductor devices used in the integrated circuit chips. This refers to the transistors, long story short. When they say MOS here, the MOSFETs here, this refers to the transistors within a chip. So in a sense, the fabrication process node, when we say things like 90 nanometers or 40 nanometers or 10 nanometers, should theoretically refer to the gate length or the size of the transistors. But through the history of the semiconductor industry, these measurements have been used in different ways, combining technical and marketing terms. And over time, in fact, today, they're pretty much completely marketing terms, because if you pick up a 7 or a 5 nanometer CPU, there's no physical characteristic in there that's actually 7 or 5 nanometers. There was a time this size referred to the actual size of the transistors or the spacing between the transistors or some physical metric like that. As transistors went from planar to 3D, they became the FETs grew into the third dimension rather than just being planar transistors. These measurements, these process nodes, they got a little more complicated to name than before. And today, when you say 7 or 5 nanometers, it's pretty much just a marketing name, but still a good indicator of how sophisticated a chip is. Still, though, what exactly does it mean? So, you know now that these names here, refers to the process node, which is some physical indication of the properties, the physical properties of a chip, right? So here is a neat comparison, a table comparing Intel's process nodes over the years, starting from 90 nanometers in 2004 all the way up to the 10 nanometers, which started production in 2019. Still no desktop products though. Alder Lake will be the first. Down here is a density metric. This translates to millions of transistors per millimeter square. And we see that 90 nanometers feature 1.45 million transistors per millimeter square, whereas 10 nanometers is supposed to feature up to 100. Intel has been on 14 for a long time now. The first 14 nanometer chips came out 2014, and we are now in 2021, pretty much towards the end of it. Last quarter, we still have only 14 nanometer CPUs out, and which feature a density of 37 to 44 million transistors millimeter square. And right there gives you some idea why 10 nanometer was so delayed. Of course, the original roadmap expected 10 nanometers to be out much earlier than it is. And here is the reason for it. Intel was probably way too optimistic. In fact, they have since admitted it. They were too aggressive in their planning for the increase in density. And that level of aggressiveness, rather than planning to take a few half steps in between, led to an insane number of delays, allowing competing fabs such as TSMC and Samsung to go well ahead of Intel right now. And AMD has had 7 nanometer CPUs fabricated by TSMC on the marketplace for the last several years now. They came out 2019, so it's been over 2 years that AMD has been on 7 nanometers. TSMC 7. Now keep in mind, you can't directly compare the process nodes from different fabrication firms purely by the name, because though it says 10 nanometers is out now, and you might think in TSMC had 7 nanometers out since 2 years, that TSMC is more ahead than they actually are, because Intel's 10 and TSMC's 7 are actually fairly equivalent to each other, and we'll see that in a moment. TSMC, however, is already on 5 nanometers. Apple's latest iPhones come out with 5 nanometer CPUs. In fact, some industry analysts say they're as good as 4 nanometer CPUs now, because it's already a refinement over TSMC's 5. So TSMC is definitely well ahead. You can ascribe whatever number you want to their manufacturing process, but they are far ahead. Here is the TSMC page highlighting various different process nodes over the years and their current projection of 3, 5, 7, and 10 nanometers. 5 nanometers started high volume production sometime last year, and we see iPhones out in the market now. AMD will be releasing the next lineup of Zen CPUs sometime next year on this process node, TSMC's 5 nanometer process node. So what exactly is in a process node? What exactly do these names indicate? Now, this might look like a bit of an intimidating chart, but stick with it a moment here, and you'll see it's not that bad. This refers, by the way, to TSMC's logic nodes. So when we say N16, that was their 16 nanometer process, and we see that when TSMC went from N16 to the N10 process, so when they shrunk down the process node from 16 nanometers down to 10, if you fabricated the same chip that you did on 16 on the 10 nanometer process, you could gain a 35% performance efficiency benefit. Or if you fabricated a chip the same physical size, you'd probably be able to squeeze in 15% more performance in terms of the raw transistor counts. Now that is an oversimplification of the whole thing, but it gives you some idea. So if you look at the physical size of these CPUs, and I had an image here somewhere, I think it was over here. No. Anyways, so if you look at the physical side, yeah, okay, this is the image I was looking for. So this right here is a wafer. You see many different chips fabricated on this wafer. Each of them will probably go through a binning process. So anyways, each individual square here is a chip. It could be one of the Core i7s or Core i5s in your notebook or your desktop, etc. Each one of these chips, if you look at the physical size of this, say this was made on the 16 nanometer process, just for the sake of the discussion here, and you fabricated a chip the same physical size on the N10 process, you could squeeze in 15% more performance in terms of raw transistor count. Once again, it's a great oversimplification of it, but you get the idea. Or you could make a chip with the same number of transistors, physically smaller and more power efficient, and gain 35% in power efficiency. That pretty much summarizes the significant changes that take place every time you shrink the process node. You can make the chip more power efficient, which means you can make a chip giving you the same performance while gaining significant performance power efficiency advantages. Or you could make chips the same physical size and around the same power consumption and gain a significant uplift in the performance, because now you can squeeze in more transistors in that space since the process node is denser. So look at this, N16 to N7 is a 40% performance gain. So you make a chip the same physical size, say 300 millimeters square. This as an example and an oversimplification once again. The same chip, the same 300 millimeter square chip on N7, that is the 7 nanometer node versus N16, would give you 40% more performance in terms of the number of transistors you could pack in there in that same physical space. Or you could make a chip with the same number of transistors, shrink it down, and get a 65% performance efficiency. So these are not just numbers, these are not just nodes, these are not just technical specs for nerds to argue over. These are very, very significant in terms of how good the end product is. If your competitor can manufacture on a significantly better node than you can, you're going to suffer, and that's what we saw happening with Intel. Intel pretty much had the perfect storm the last few years. Their stagnation on quad-core CPUs caught up to them, as did their overly aggressive and somewhat borderline arrogant projections for their process node enhancements, which prevented them from going down to 10 nanometers sooner than they could have had they been a little more conservative or planned a few half steps along the way. If you look at TSMC's chart here, that's kind of what their strategy has been, right? They don't try to make huge jumps. They are more than happy to make half steps along the way, enhancing their process, learning along the way, and having relatively smaller jumps between generations at times, but consistently executing on new process nodes. So, Alder Lake finally ushers in Intel's long overdue 10 nanometer process node, and that is one of the first and most significant things about Alder Lake. I'm going to leave a link to these articles down below. If you're interested, I'd highly recommend you check them out. Just before moving on, you can have a look at Intel's 10 nanometer versus TSMC 7 nanometer process nodes. This is a chart from Wikichip, and you can see a lot of physical metrics between the two are actually pretty similar, which is why people say TSMC's 10 is actually equal to TSMC. It's more or less equivalent to TSMC's 7 nanometer process. And Intel has even decided to rename some of their upcoming process nodes to better represent that. Over here is a comparison of transistor densities, once again in million transistors per millimeter square, between the various fabs: IBM, TSMC, Intel, and Samsung. This right here is an IBM theoretical thing. They have kind of demonstrated it, but keep in mind, getting to a technology first and demonstrating it is very different from going into high volume manufacturing. It's likely that they never get high volume out of this, in which case it would just be purely theoretical. But definitely there'd be learnings here that could help the technology as a whole move forward. But here's a comparison of the densities, and you see TSMC's 7 versus Intel's 10, where Intel's 10 is actually a bit more superior in this regard. So namings might change and new charts might come out, and Intel has already announced a new naming scheme, and I leave these articles in the description. If you're interested to dig in further, I highly recommend it. This right here is a fascinating image from what I presume would be a scanning electron microscope, showing the gate length. This is an actual image in nanometers. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? These are so small. The human hair, each hair on your head, each strand of hair is 80,000 nanometers across. 80,000. So that just gives you some idea. Pretty amazing stuff. It's witchcraft. Probably the most advanced technology human beings have right now. So 10 nanometers, Intel's Alder Lake bringing it into desktop. Big deal. Really, really big deal. And that's the first thing that really stands out about Alder Lake. The next thing, arguably just as big a deal, is the adoption of a hybrid core architecture. So if you go back to the slide over here and you have a look at the diagram over here or this image over here, right? You see slightly different color rectangles here. This is not just design. This actually represents a very important, very significant change. Each one of these dark blue squares here highlights what Intel now calls a big core or a high performance core, which is their terminology for big cores. And these guys down here represent 4. Each one of these, you see 4 small squares inside the big square. Each one of these represent 4 high efficiency cores, which is the equivalent of the little cores. Now, why am I saying big and little? It's because if you look at your cell phone, you'll see that ARM, which is the architecture behind the Qualcomm chips and the MediaTek chips inside most Android phones, and even Apple's A series chips inside their iPhones, has been on a big little architecture for quite some time now, where, see, cell phones are really small, they're tiny, thin rectangles, they go in your pocket, they need to be very power efficient, they don't have any kind of active cooling, there's no fan on your phone to cool it down, and battery life is very important, which leads to some pretty good innovation in terms of how the CPUs of these smartphones have evolved over the years as they've gotten more powerful. Big Little is at the forefront of one such innovation, where you have a cluster of big cores, which are more high performance cores, but most of the time they're left idle until a highly demanding workload comes along that actually needs that kind of performance. And then you have a cluster of small cores that handles most of the background tasks and the stuff going on. Now have a look at this computer itself, right? We have some software running here. We can see a few things open over here. But if I open up the task manager and I have a look at the processes, there are hundreds of processes running in the background. So any given point of time, granted, some of this stuff is software that I have myself opened up and I could close it, but despite that, you're going to have a lot of services of Windows, of Microsoft themselves. Here you see 97 Windows processes that will run regardless of whether I had my apps open or not. And what you also see is that quite a few of them are not really using a lot of power. They don't need a lot of high performance compute going on. But nonetheless, my system here has a Ryzen 8 core CPU. Each core can handle two threads at once, which means you can switch between workloads rather than staying idle. That's called hyper-threading, but that's a different thing. However, that's why you see 16 graphs here. But there are 8 physical cores. These are 8 big cores, and they're active all the time. So if I had something intensive running here, say a game or some kind of a compression, decompression workload, or something like code compilation, video rendering, something like that, that'd be taking up a lot of my CPU horsepower, and that would kind of justify the high performance big cores. But what about all this stuff that just keeps my cores active and doesn't really need it? Couldn't this stuff be offloaded to a less powerful but more power efficient core? And that's what Alder Lake is hoping to bring in. That sounds like a great idea. Obviously, it's been around in the mobile space for quite some time now, but translating it to the desktop is not that straightforward. It's quite a big undertaking. It's a huge change, and the reason for that being, the operating system here, right now, it has all this work. It just has. It's again. I'm going to oversimplify this a great deal, but it somehow figures out the priority of the processes based on what's running now, what's in the background, what's important, what's not, and assigns them to the cores. All it has to do, somewhat, is predict their priority or understand what's more important at this given point in time. But now you throw in a hybrid core architecture where you have high performance and high efficiency cores, it's pretty much useless if your operating system doesn't know how to use them. So there's a component called the scheduler, which is a piece of software, and it can also be a dedicated hardware chip. Your GPUs today, AMD's Radeon lineup of graphics GPUs have a hardware scheduler on them. The dedicated task of that chip or that block of silicon is to assign work to the GPU cores in an appropriate manner. However, so basically you can have a scheduler in both software and hardware. That's just the point I wanted to get across. But scheduling is a big deal. There are many different scheduling algorithms. Just go and Google OS scheduling, which is operating system scheduling. You'll see thousands upon thousands of results, lots of stuff to learn. People have done their PhDs in some of the sub areas that come within scheduling. So scheduling is a big deal. And if the operating system cannot schedule the work appropriately, you won't get the benefits of a hybrid architecture. So scheduling is a big thing, and both Intel and Microsoft are aware of that. Microsoft has had some bad press in the past when it comes down to its OS scheduling. The most prominent example being with AMD's Threadripper 2000 series of CPUs. Those CPUs up core counts to 32 cores in one socket, but the way they were constructed, they had 4 independent chiplets within one package. So you see this rectangle here. Imagine 4 of them on this circuit here, and imagine that's your CPU, that's your Threadripper CPU goes into your motherboard. The way AMD architected that is that 2 of these clusters will have direct access to the system's RAM, whereas the other 2 would have non-uniform memory access, or NUMA, having to go through the other 2 blocks of silicon that actually had the direct access to memory. That non-uniform architecture led to a huge performance hit on Windows, because Windows couldn't figure out how to appropriately schedule tasks across the cores to work around this NUMA limitation of non-uniform access to the system's RAM. Linux did a much better job, and you can find a lot of benchmarks online talking, comparing just how much more performant Ryzen Threadripper 2000 is on Linux versus Windows. So scheduling is a big deal, and they're of course 100% aware of that. If you go through their architectures, their slides, and I'm I'm going to link this out, you'll see that they have dedicated a lot of development resources of Alder Lake into figuring out the scheduling aspects. So they're introducing something called the Intel Thread Detector. Quick side note here: when we say thread, so the way things work is, say you launch a piece of software. Here I see Google Chrome running. That's an app. The software creates a process, and these are the processes that are running. Processes spawn threads, which are the bare minimum unit of execution. So a thread is like a collection of instructions and data that needs to be executed by, to get results. So threads are what are dispatched to your physical CPU cores. And when we say that, you see that right now there are 5,000 active threads on this machine from 300 processes. So obviously processes spawn many threads, and the thread detector, Intel claims, will monitor runtime. Will monitor the runtime instruction mix of each thread as well as the state of each core with nanosecond precision. Provides runtime feedback to the operating system to make optimal scheduling decisions for any workload or workflow, and dynamically adapts guidance based on the thermal design point, operating conditions, power settings, various parameters here without any user input. So scheduling is a big deal. It's really going to come down to how well they can schedule it. If it gets through well, there's potential for huge uplifts in performance, especially for things like laptops and even the data center. Now think about a laptop, right? You have a portable device. Battery life is very important. If most of the background work can be offloaded to the little cores and they're way more performance, power efficient. In fact, looking at the chart, just look at them physically, right? You can fit in 4 high efficiency cores in the same silicon real estate that it takes to fit in one single high performance core. If that also translates to their power efficiency, that means each high efficiency core consumes just a quarter of the energy required by a high performance core, and most of these threads can be offloaded to the high efficiency cores when you don't have anything very performance demanding running on the system. Then that could have a huge positive impact on the battery lives of portable laptops and ultrabooks and machines. Same time, you talk about a data center, thousands of CPUs, thousands of thousands of cores, thousands of sockets, massive scale. That's why they're called hyperscalers. You can even if you save 1 watt per core, and say you have machines, you have racks running thousands of cores, you're saving thousands of watts there. So the funny thing is, this has the ability to benefit the hyperscalers and the mobile users the most, but it also can have a big impact to the desktop, especially for latency sensitive applications such as gaming. So when you look at gaming is highly latency sensitive, it's fast paced, it's hundreds of frames a second, and if you can free up the big cores, leaving them mostly free to deal with that high latency sensitive, high performance requirement games, while most of the background stuff is offloaded to the high efficiency cores, then for all you know, you could maybe have a much more smooth and consistent gaming experience with maybe far fewer jitters and lags or stutters than you would on an architecture where everything is running on the big cores, because there's a physical separation of what processes, what threads are assigned to the big cores and to the little cores. Again, all this is speculation. Is really going to come down to how well Windows can do it. And one of the big changes with Windows 11 coming out a few days from now is apparently a heavily upgraded OS scheduler that's dedicated to this. So that's two things. It's 10 nanometers, and then we have the scheduling aspect, the big little architecture. That's already two big changes. Last thing I want to talk about is the DDR5 DRAM generation. DDR5 is the next generation of DRAM, which is the RAM modules that plug into your motherboard. DDR generations tend to stick around quite a while. DDR4 has been around since 2014. So it's an uplift, in a generational uplift after almost 6 years. What does a generational uplift such as this bring along? It brings along twice the bandwidth of the RAM and the capabilities of just having much faster access to memory. Now that is a big deal. That's a big deal because a lot of development resources and architecting efforts in designing high performance CPUs today are dedicated to solving the problem of instruction starvation. Instruction starvation is this scenario where your CPU cores are really fast but they have nothing to do. So you could have the fastest cores on the planet, but if you don't have work to feed them with, it's just not going to end well, right? You're not going to really derive much performance out of it. And one of the ways they get around that is adding many levels of cache, which is a storage, which is silicon, real estate dedicated to pure storage within the CPU core itself. Now CPUs such as this and AMD Ryzen CPUs have three levels of cache built into them. You have the level 1 cache, the level 2 cache, and the level 3 cache. With each increasing level, you get further and further away from the core. So the level 1 cache is literally physically the closest to the core as compared to the level 2 and then the level 3, which are these black stripes here. And the further away you get from the core, the more the latency goes up. It might not sound like a lot, but it has a big impact. And when the CPU is executing a process, a thread, the less the lesser the amount of time that it has to wait around for instructions and data, the faster you're going to get your results. So a cache hit in the L1 cache is way better than the cache hit in an L3 cache, which is many magnitudes better than a complete cache miss. A cache miss, man, that's tongue twisting, right? A cache miss in all your caches on your CPU core, and then the CPU having to go to the memory to fetch that instruction, which is again infinitely better than it having to go to the hard drive or your SSD, or you know, God save us, the network. But long story short, you want instructions and data as close to the core as possible to prevent the problem of instruction starvation. However, just like it's just one of those things, right? You can't really have a scenario. In an ideal world, you'd never have instruction starvation. In an ideal world, all the data, all the instructions are right there for the CPU to work on. But we live in a world that's far away from an ideal world, and fetching data from the system RAM is a very common occurrence, and DDR5 doubling bandwidth in that category is a big deal for that reason. So there you have it. You have 10 nanometers, you have a hybrid CPU design, you have DDR5 memory coming out. Intel also highlights PCIe Gen 5, Thunderbolt 4, Wi-Fi 6. Pretty much everything goes along the same path as DDR5 in terms of doubling bandwidth, doubling data transfer rates, etc., or at least significantly increasing them, if not outright doubling them. PCIe Gen 5, I think there's some confusion about this. This might be only for your NVMe SSDs initially, or only for the GPUs. It's one of them, it's not for both of them. So you're not going to have Gen 5 GPUs as well as NVMe drives with Alder Lake right away. That's going to take some time. And you could even argue that it's really unnecessary today, because Gen 4 has barely set in and Gen 4 is already crazy fast. It's going to take a while before Gen 4 NVMe drives and Gen 4 interconnects for your GPUs are saturated. So you could argue that Gen 4 is a long ways away from mainstream adoption and saturation, let alone saturation for Gen 5. But well, progress is progress, right? As long as it's backward compatible, no complaints, man. Give it to us. So these are the big things. Alder Lake could return back Intel to competitiveness, could turn this around. Maybe it's Intel's best shot in a very long time to take back the performance crown, to take back these charts. What about AMD? Is AMD going to keep quiet? Is AMD just sitting still? No, they're not doing that. Last year, AMD came out with the 5000 series of Ryzen CPUs, right? 5000 is in fact so performant that AMD, in some ways, could be pretty lazy when they went to 5000 from the 3000 series. There were several things that could have been improved, but they simply held it back because they already had a 19% uplift in pure instructions per clock output between Zen 2 and Zen 3 by just making the architectural changes that they came out with. So the end result is that Zen 2, which is your Ryzen 3000 CPUs, yeah, I know it's confusing. AMD's figured out a lot of amazing things when it comes to CPUs, but naming is not one of them, and Intel is just as guilty with it. I mean, just go through. Let's just go through the ARC lineup and look at the damn names here, man. I mean, Core i9 1088 5H. Is that even, is that a name, man? Anyways, whatever. I digress. Uh, so Zen 2 on Ryzen 3000 back out in 2019, and Zen 3 with Ryzen 5000 coming out last year 2020. A lot of things are similar between them. They are similar between them. Sorry, that is, for example, they're both on TSMC 7 nanometer process. They both have a separate chiplet for the I/O aspects, which is your memory controller and other, other I/O interconnects, such as the PCI Express link connections to the CPU, for your graphics card and for your NVMe drives. So they have a separate chiplet for that, and that's fabricated on the 12 nanometer process. So both Zen 2 and Zen 3 are 7 plus 12, but the difference between them, the big difference is Zen 2 featured 8 core CPUs, right? But the 8 cores of Zen. So the easiest way to show you this, and bear with me here, but this is prominent to our discussion. So if you have a look at Ryzen's core, this is a die shot from the first generation of Ryzen CPUs. You will see that you have 4 cores here and 4 cores here. So while it's an 8 core CPU, there is a separation. So if you see this, if you split it up in half, you'll see a mirroring between these two sides of many different aspects. So you have 4 cores in a core complex coming together to make a core compute die, right? You have 8 cores on the die, but there are 2 complexes with 4 cores each. Now, the implication of this is if you have a process that has some threads here and some threads here, there is a latency in communicating them. This split up of 4 cores, of 4 core complexes, which is CCX, continued with Zen 2 as well, even though Zen 2 took up the chiplet approach, making a big difference to the way Zen 1 and Zen 2 are, but Zen 2 kept this approach of having core complexes with 4 cores each, while Zen 3 unified that into a single 8 core complex. So that's pretty big uplift right there, and that allowed AMD to get a 19% performance uplift pretty much right off the bat. Of course, there were other improvements as well, slight refinements to the memory controller, better cache latencies, etc, etc. But AMD is not sitting still while Intel comes out with Alder Lake. While they're not ready to release their own next generation Zen CPUs on the next process node, which would be TSMC 5 and with DDR5 memory, they are doing something very revolutionary, which is coming out with 3D stacked Zen CPUs. 3D stacking is a big deal. Okay, I've been hearing about it for I don't know, man, couple of decades. It's been something that's been researched, and the amount of money that's been spent on R&D to get 3D stacking working is absolutely staggering. It's pretty simple. It's a beautifully simple concept. As the name implies, it means taking a slice of silicon and stacking it on top of another one, which is why you say it's 3D stacked. And there are many, while this is done pretty successfully in your flash memory and your DRAM, etc., or not DRAM, your flash memory, either ways, doing 3D stacking on compute dies, on compute chips, is a whole different ball game with a whole different set of challenges, because you have compute hardware that produces significantly more heat, and dealing with that heat is just one problem. There are many other problems, many other nitty-gritties. It's taken decades and billions in R&D to kind of get there, and we're still not fully there. But Zen 3D is going to be the first 3D stacked consumer chip, and what they're doing is they're stacking cache even more cache onto the CPU. So this right here, if you look at this, so this here, this beautiful image, this elaborates the chiplet approach that Zen 2 and Zen 3 series CPUs have taken, which is a Ryzen 3000 and Ryzen 5000. So this big guy here is a 12 nanometer IO die, which is a piece of silicon that contains the logic for IO operations, which is input output, just data flow through the system. So it is this chip here that handles communication of your compute, which is these guys here, the cores here, and communication between the cores and the system RAM, the GPUs, your PCI Express devices, also some USB, SATA, Wi-Fi, etc. No, not Wi-Fi. Sorry, I take that back. But yeah, storage devices, and that's been moved off here. So this is 12 nanometers because AMD said, and apparently rightly so, that not all silicon benefits from better process nodes. So we can save money, make it more cost effective by taking a chiplet approach where you separate things out. So you separate out the logic, the core compute from the IO, and these two guys here, there's two of them. These are the compute dies. There's 8 cores in each of them. This being a 5000 series CPU, that's a cluster of 8 cores here, cluster of 8 cores here for 16 cores. The 6 and 8 core CPUs just feature one of these, but you can see the one on the right here is 3D stacked. So it has additional cache stacked on top of it. Look at this image here. And this guy over here, they have stacked 64 MB of additional L3 cache. So we're talking just about L3. So L1 is a few megabytes, L2 is a bit more, and L3, Zen 3 and I think even Zen 2 feature 32 megabytes of L3 cache per 8 core complex. Okay, so per complex of 8 cores, per cluster of 8 cores, there's 32. The 3D stacking another 64 megabytes on top of that for 92 megabytes of L3 cache alone per 8 core cluster, per 8 core CCD, which is your core compute die. And the benefit of doing this, AMD touts, just 3D stacking this leads to anywhere from 4 to 25 for an average of close to 15-18% performance uplift. That's 15 to 18% performance uplift is a generational uplift. So imagine that it's the same 7 nanometer process node from 2019. It's the same 12 nanometer IO die. It's the same architecture, the Zen 3 architecture from 2020. But by 3D stacking additional cache on it, and further cutting down, further solving the instruction starvation problem, further cutting down communication with the RAM, and Zen has a much higher latency when communicating with RAM compared with Intel. They're seeing an almost generational uplift in performance. So imagine how embarrassing it would be for Intel if the shiny new Alder Lake CPUs on 10 nanometers with DDR5 memory with a hybrid architecture are beat by a 1 year old, year and a half old at this point, AMD Zen 3 architecture with just some cache on it. These are going to be productized, as being confirmed by AMD. They actually come into consumer space, which is very surprising because when we thought about 3D stacking, it was an unsaid given that the enterprise space would get it first. Just like the best automotive technologies go to the Ferraris and the Lamborghinis, and then they trickle down to your everyday car, right? It was kind of like that, where 3D stacking was one of those things that it was unsaid, but the enterprise guys were always going to get it first. But no, turns out we were happily wrong there. And we are going to have this productized with a Zen 3 based Ryzen processor for the desktop, coming somewhere very early next year, most likely. So I would say CES, the Consumer Electronics Show in Jan, is very likely. Or given that 3D stacking is just such a big deal, it's also very likely AMD hosts an entirely independent event anywhere between December 21 and Feb 22. And that would be embarrassing for Intel. AMD doesn't even need to take back the full top spot for that. I mean, just a year and a half old AMD architecture on an older process node from 2019 with everything that AMD's done before, and then just stacking cache on it. It only gives you some kind of a preview of what Zen 4 will bring when AMD goes down to 5 nanometers and DDR5 later next year. So a lot of exciting stuff coming out in the CPU space. Stay tuned over here. We'll cover all of that. I'll be talking in detail about all the architectures, everything that comes up. If there's something specific you want me to ramble about, put it down in the comments. I'll have a look at it and get to it. And thank you for watching this. Links are going to be in the description. Do check it out and leave your comments and questions down below. And if you enjoyed this content, consider subscribing in case I happen to make more videos. See you later. Bye.